Hello, Internet. This is Rodigan, and welcome to another exciting Rock'em Sock'em Pulse-Pounding edition of the EveryJoe podcast. Hashtag EJPC, your political safe space. This is an exciting day because after it's been an exciting week because after what seems like 85 years, we finally started voting in the 2016 election, which we'll be discussing coming up with our two great guests. First, and I'm actually very excited to have this gentleman on the show because there are three key points to when I discovered activism. And one of which was when my boss caught me slacking off at work one day on the Drudge Report. She called me into her office, and here I am. I expect I'm getting reprimanded, and instead she told me, listen, if you like politics, you should check out the captain's quarters, which eventually became Hot Air, and that's one of the main reasons why I'm here. So if you hate hearing from me, you can blame our guest at morrisseyhotair.com. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
And, of course, returning to the show, as you're doing the history of EveryJoe trivia question, she is the second return guest that we've had, who actually caused a little bit of a ruckus this weekend because of her shameless shillery of the Rubio campaign and how much she hates the grassroots and the Tea Party and puppies and apple pie.
You've been reading too much Twitter.
Writing for the IJ Review and about 85 other places. Sarah Rump, welcome back.
Hello, thank you for having me back.
So people actually come to think of, we'll get to the article that you caused chaos with in a little bit, but I just want to, like I said, we finally voted. People finally voted for the Iowa caucus, and I want to get you both of your takes on what you think that the main story is. For me, I think the main story isn't so much about how well Cruz and Rubio did, as much as it is how bad Trump didn't do. And I only say that not because I can't stand him, which I can't, but like prior to the voting started, I was talking to one of the coaches at my gym because we'll always talk about this before we start training, and he was asking what I thought, and I had said, well, if it's regular turnout, it's probably going to be Cruz, and then maybe Trump or Rubio will get flipped. But if it's record turnout and there's a lot of extra people, that probably means they're all coming out to vote for Trump. And while it was record turnout and the most people that have ever voted in a Republican Iowa caucus, they seem to turn out to vote against Trump, which is why I kind of think he's like more like the loser, more than like Trump and then like Cruz and Rubio are winners, even though they're both big winners. Ed, what's your take?
Well, I think that the Trump as loser is a little overstated, and I'm not necessarily a guy who's keen on Donald Trump, but you take a look at what he got last night, which was about 24% of the vote, and where he was polling, which was about 28% of the vote, and that's really a margin of error difference between the polling and what the actual result was. And this is a guy whose ground organization is at best rudimentary in Iowa. And he still managed to pull 24% based on his personality, based on his free media coverage, and his celebrity status. So I don't necessarily consider that Donald Trump was a big loser or that this was a humiliation. I know a lot of people are thinking that, but I actually think that this was just sort of what cost him there was maybe not showing up for the debate, and final outcome was about 6.5 points higher than what his RCP average was going into the caucus yesterday. And that is a significant difference.
Polls leading up to Iowa the last couple of weeks all showed him with a sizable lead, and that disappeared. So he went from being the front runner to almost coming in third. A couple different weather flukes, a couple different tweaks here and there in advertising targeting, and we might be talking about second place Marco Rubio. I mean, that was so close that they ended up getting the exact same number. Got 8, and Marco Rubio and Donald Trump walked away with 7 last night. The other thing I think was interesting, you talk about me writing for everybody. I wrote a piece for Opportunity Lives that got posted in the morning that looked at some of the late breaking polls that included in their polling universe Friday and Saturday, and those showed one of the pollsters saw a significant decrease for Cruz and an upswing for Marco Rubio. There was some other exit polling that found that a lot of the late breaking and late decision makers were going for Rubio. All this talk of whether Marco is a real thing or just a cute hashtag, there really were some signs of people drifting towards Rubio. But now with he still does not have an organized, concentrated, great ground game anywhere. So with him not getting the free media, with finally some of the Republican PACs and things starting to throw stuff at Donald Trump. One of those PACs that Rick and they were working on actually had an ad that was shown to move people by a couple points. Once all this starts coming to bear, he's not getting the free media. He doesn't have the ground game. I think he's going to find it an increase. I don't think he's going to drop out anytime soon, but it's going to be an increasing upward slog for him.
And I think most people would agree that Cruz had to win Iowa.
Yes.
Now he could take a little bit of a break, and now it gets to the point where Rubio and Trump have to finish top 2 in New Hampshire to move forward. And Ed, I was wondering, A, if you agree, or B, if you could see any of the other candidates, like, playing spoiler and getting in, or are we looking at a 3-man race right now?
No, I don't think we're looking at a 3-man race. And certainly the 3 people who came out of Iowa look good. But I mean, Jeb Bush spent money in Iowa, which was a bad mistake on his part. He should have just stayed in New Hampshire. But John Kasich wasn't spending a lot of money or time in Iowa. In fact, he was in New Hampshire last night rather than in Iowa at the caucuses. And Chris Christie has been basically living in New Hampshire. So I think you're looking at a 6-person race, if you will, in New Hampshire. And everybody else who's not part of that, Ben Carson, maybe you could argue would be 7th. But coming out of New Hampshire, I think you're only going to see 3 or 4 people who have a realistic shot at, Super Tuesday type of wins. The thing about New Hampshire is this: it's only 7 days away. I mean, so it's a week from today, and the RCP average as of this morning over the past month in New Hampshire has Trump up by 22 points over the nearest rival. Now, that may change somewhat, but I don't know that Trump did poorly enough to lose a 22-point lead in 7 days. In fact, I'd be hard-pressed to know what Donald Trump could possibly do to lose a 22-point lead in 7 days. Certainly,
maybe eating a puppy on television.
Possibly, but then people might say, "Well, look, the
puppy was a loser.
The puppy's a loser, and he's advertising for spaying and neutering your pets. Why aren't you Republicans so biased against Donald Trump?"
You're so right. I bet that's what would happen.
Exactly.
I wish you were exaggerating. I really do.
I'm not exaggerating, but look, I mean, the real test is going to be who gets in the top 3 in New Hampshire, and then South Carolina will be the key, because South Carolina, Trump has a big lead, but it's not as big as it is in New Hampshire. There's more time to get to South Carolina, and South Carolina is not really Donald Trump land. That's more Ted Cruz land. That's more Marco Rubio land, who picked up, by the way, an extremely critical endorsement from Senator Tim Scott, very well liked, and a Tea Party Tea Party favorite, really, in South Carolina. So I don't think you look at New Hampshire as necessarily the make or break state for Donald Trump or Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz. I think you look to South Carolina, and South Carolina, by the way, is a state where Jeb Bush isn't going to play well. John Kasich's not going to play well. Chris Christie's not going to play well. So if none of those 3 guys end up in the top 3 in New Hampshire, I think they pack it in, and I think their donors tell them, go back home because it's not working. We're gonna try to land with either Cruz or Rubio and try to stop Trump. That's probably what will happen after New Hampshire.
Yeah, and I think going into South Carolina, like, the big endorsement that's left is Nikki Haley, and I was wondering, Rubio's gotten Gowdy, Rubio's gotten Tim Scott. Unfortunately, and this is you could read about this all over the internet. A lot of key people in Rubio's campaign are persona non grata with the Nikki Haley people, because besides trying to run a brutal primary against her, they also tried to start a rumor that she was having an affair after she beat them. And I was wondering,
are we sure? Is that something that we know for sure that Rubio staffers were directly involved in that, or is that because I'd always thought that there was a rumor of a rumor? We've got like circling rumors.
Okay. Someone watching this right now, fact check me. The impression I always had was that they were confirmed, at least maybe not involved in the rumor, but involved some dirty stuff. And there was an article in BuzzFeed that came out after the response to the State of the Union that basically said the people who are working for Rubio's campaign are pretty much dead to like Haley people. And I'm wondering if that would affect her endorsing him. Would she endorse Cruz just because, F you, or or do we think? I mean, or in all honesty, do we think endorsements even matter that much at this point?
Oh,
I see her more likely to stay out. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, because that's exactly what I was going to say. So you go, Sarah.
Honestly, I see her more likely to stay out. She's in a very, very interesting position right now where she's got pretty high approval ratings among conservative activists, both in her state and around the country. She's still very young. She's got a very bright future. And her name is getting thrown down as a possible VP pick, if not this time, then in a future election cycle. So if she steps in a primary where everybody is right neck and neck with each other and she doesn't pick the winner, there's a lot more upsides for Nikki Haley for doing what Ben Sasse did, where he said Trump is not the option and everyone should go for Cruz or Rubio. I see Haley either staying out of it or saying more anti-Trump things. I mean, her after the State of the Union speech was essentially a "Come on, good Republicans, Trump's not our answer." That kind of message is a much safer strategy for her.
I agree. I would add that there's probably nobody better positioned in the Republican Party right now for a VP slot, because regardless of which one of these three men end up as the nominee, you're going to need to have somebody with executive experience in politics as your running mate, because you have to be able to answer the heartbeat away question when you're doing this. And none of these guys have executive experience in government. So even if it's Trump, Nikki Haley makes a lot of sense as a VP, regardless of what she said in the State of the Union address. But certainly for Ted Cruz and for Marco Rubio, she makes all sorts of sense as well. So my guess is that she's going to keep her options open by just trying to be the fair arbiter of everything that's going on in South Carolina and the person who's sort of managing the process for the Republican Party in that state. And Tim Scott can issue his endorsements. I don't think Nikki Haley I don't think she says a peep about it.
And, I want to switch gears for a little bit, because while the primary is fun, the big question is who's going to actually win the election and defeat Hillary Clinton. And as luck would have it, Mr. Morrissey has a book coming out on April 12th called Going Red, discussing just exactly that. Certain states where we get, there it is.
Good job.
Hey, thank you.
Hey.
Certain states that George Bush ran in 2004, that we lost in 2008 and 2012, that we could turn to go red. So, Ed, tell us about it.
So, great. Yeah, it's coming out on April 12th from Crown Forum. This is actually the galley proof that we send out to for publicity purposes to a handful of people. But I get a few free of these, so that's sort of RHIP. I get a chance to hold this up in front of cameras now. The book title is Going Red, the 2 million voters who will elect the next president, how conservatives can win them. What I did was I looked at 7 swing states, which I think will be in play in 2016. And I looked for the bellwether counties in these states. And I actually went out there. I interviewed people. I interviewed voters. I interviewed local office holders, state office holders, people who are on the ground doing sort of ground game that is required to talk about what happened in 2008 and in 2012 for Republicans to lose these counties, with one exception, and to lose these states, with one exception, in 2012. And there's demographic challenges. There's messaging challenges, but really it's about ground organization, and it's about being in these communities, not just lecturing to them. And that's what the thrust of the book is. I interviewed over 100 people for this book. And this is the actual subtitle on this book should have been How I Spent My Spring and Summer Vacation, because that's I was on the road for like 3 months, and my wife was getting to where she wondered, who I was towards the end of that, but she's very supportive of this, and she's thrilled about the book. But I did a ton of traveling last year. I'm really looking forward to start talking about this. The book is in the context of the general election. It is not in the context of the primary, but what it talks about is what the nominee will have to do and what the party will have to do in these areas that Barack Obama was able to flip, to get them to flip back. And it's not as easy as it sounds, but it is not impossible either.
What did you hear, like, when you, obviously when you talk to elected officials, they'll always try and spin you just because that's their job. But what did you hear when you're talking to voters? Because it's one thing I've noticed the past couple of years. I've been letting everyone else deal with the national politics. I've been trying to focus things more locally. And it's one thing I find when you talk to people locally, while those of us who blog or involved in activism, everything's about left versus right, conservative versus liberal, and like bitter partisan fights like that. When you talk to actual voters that aren't on Twitter all the time or aren't watching Fox News, MSNBC all the time, they're looking for people who could just get stuff done.
Yes.
And I know, like, there was 2 races I was working on in this past year, where one of which the Republican was a 3-1 underdog, and one they were a 4-1 underdog and grossly outfunded. But just because they actually talked to the voters and had a message to sell, they wound up pulling it off. And I was kind of curious, like, what did the actual voters tell you about this specific district that would help us?
Well, it depends on the district, right?
Yeah.
Let me give you an example that actually didn't make it into the book. So I'm in Cincinnati, which is under an EPA mandate to separate its sewage and storm drain systems, because up until very recently they have been combined, and the EPA has been for the last 40 years trying to change that, because Cincinnati is hardly the only one that does this. So Cincinnati came up with this very expensive plan to meet the EPA standards, and the EPA accepted it. Well, in between those two things, they discovered that they could actually do the same thing. They could accomplish the same thing for 40% lower cost, and it would be effective. It would meet the standards of the EPA, and the EPA refuses to reopen the case. So Cincinnati is going to have, their water district has to go with this 40% higher cost plan that is really not going to deliver any other benefits that the lower cost plan would not. And it means that Cincinnati residents are going to spend hundreds of dollars a year in assessments that are completely unnecessary. And if you know Cincinnati is not a wealthy city. It certainly has some wealthy pockets, but it is a hard luck working class city, and one that has where the population has significantly declined over the last 40 years. It's the only place I went to which had a net population loss. And so when you talk about the EPA, I mean, this is the issue with Republicans. They'll come into a place like Cincinnati and talk about, we have to do, federal government's too big. There's too much regulation. And they talk about these things in what I call 30,000 foot terms. What they should be doing is they should be saying, when you get your bill from the Metropolitan Water District and it's $70 higher than it used to be every month, or $60 higher than it used to be every month, do you know why that is? And everybody in Cincinnati will know why that is. And they'll say, that's the type of regulation, silly regulation that we need to get rid of. There's examples of that in Colorado. There's examples of that in Wisconsin, in Green Bay, where, which is one of the other places that I looked at. There's examples of that in Tampa, although it's not as big of an issue there. That's how you deal with your ideology, is you have to put it in terms of how the people live their lives in these individual communities. Because when you just go in there and say government regulation's too big and we got to get rid of it, they're going, yeah. I've heard all this before. But when you walk in there and you say, look, I've seen your water bill. Do you know why you're getting stiffed on your water bill? This is the reason why. And these are the administrators that were responsible for it. And your city tried to fix it. And Barack Obama and his people don't want to fix it because they want you to they want to force you into the plan that they like more than the plan that will actually work. That's getting where people live. And I would even argue, don't even mention Barack Obama. He's gone. He's retiring. He's out. There is an emotional attachment to those 2008 and 2012 votes that creates a large emotional obstacle for people to listen to the Republican message, because people are still defending their decision to vote for Obama in 2008 and again in 2012. They should avoid it. They should go around it. He's a non-issue. People want to hear about the future. They don't want to hear about the past. That's part of what's in the book as well.
Yeah, and I guess Sarah, we'll go to you with that. And everything you just said makes perfect sense. And we discussed on episodes like this and like some of the conferences we go to, we discuss these things all the time. Why doesn't the party actually do that? Because literally everything you just said to a T makes perfect common sense to anyone who has common sense, and yet we're going to start campaigning and talk about how Obama is a lawless president, and that's how we think we're going to win.
I mean, I don't think that's what they're all doing. I mean, one of the things that when people talk about electability, the reason that Rubio's name comes up so often is that he had a very good track record of having that kind of message. I mean, that's his actual campaign motto, the New American Century thing. That's saying that the current situation isn't great, and he certainly has criticized the Obama administration quite a bit, but he's not running on beating Obama. He's running on saying that there are things that are affecting your life that need to be fixed, and this is how we're going to do it. Getting things done, there's a point, and I think Ed made a really good point. The Republicans can't just run on, oh, government's too big, there's too many regulations. That's too vague, and vague, fluffy kind of concepts like that don't really light a fire under people. And the other problem is that as much as Republicans may not want to admit it, there is a certain amount of government regulation and support that people are either neutral on or supportive of or very enthusiastic about. So, I mean, you look at all the trouble that a candidate can get into if they're perceived as wanting to slash Medicare or slash Social Security, that's going to be dangerous thing. There's the Republicans do better, and Rubio, when he ran in Florida with all of our senior citizens there, when he ran in 2010, he had a message of entitlement reform, but he was very careful to phrase it as these programs are financially unviable the way that they're structured right now. To save them, we have to make reforms, or the whole thing will collapse. So when you're phrasing it that way, that we understand, it's not just we have to cut all the regulations, we have to cut all the government spending, we have to take everything, because we may not like to admit it, we cannot win on we're going to take all the government away. It's just not possible.
Yeah. And just to wrap up, because we're running out of time, I wanted to get both of your take on one thing that also has, I think ties into like what some of the stuff Ed's talking about in his book, is that when it comes to like talking directly to people, when it comes to talking to new audiences, and when it comes to how we talk to them, one guy who seemed to have his act together and was focusing on doing like that was Rand Paul, in like talking to the NAACP, the way he uses social media, and the way he's always trying to like actually go to these places and talk to people. What happened to that guy, and what the hell happened to his campaign?
I'll let you go, Sarah.
Oh, man. I think that honestly, I think the bigger problem is that as much as Rand Paul was hoping there was a, quote, libertarian lane in this election, with the national security issues that we've got right now, with the border crisis on the Texas-Mexican border last year, with becoming, 5 years ago, had you heard of ISIS? I hadn't. With terror attacks and horrifying bloody pictures on the news. I mean, it's hard to get those pictures out of your mind. Message, while a lot of conservatives find him very, very good and smart on the financial stuff. Yes, audit the Fed. Yes, the federal government's too big. Yes, they're too intrusive. Yes, we've got privacy rights that are being disrespected on a constant basis by our government. When people see the news about the San Bernardino shootings, when they see the horrible pictures that came from Paris, and the Boston Marathon here just a little bit before that, his message sounds naive. It's and that makes it a very tough sell. This is not a year for a Rand Paul candidate. Now, I do hope that whoever the Republican nominee is involves Rand Paul in some way. I mean, just imagine a Rubio or Cruz is elected, and while they're preparing to get sworn into office, they let the rumor slip that they're considering Rand Paul for chairman of the Fed. They don't pick him. Just letting the rumor out and had Rand Paul being seen going to the White House for a meeting would be enough to make the Fed clean up their act fairly quickly. I think we could get reforms in about a minute and a half. So there is a very good message that Rand Paul has. The libertarian message needs to be incorporated and respected by the Republican Party, but this is year.
I think it's basic. You want a libertarian in the Senate. You don't want a libertarian as commander-in-chief.
There you go. In much
really,
less words, much more sufficient.
I think really that's it. I like Rand Paul in the Senate, and that's the reason why I'm hoping he gets back and starts working on his reelection campaign, because I want him back in the Senate in 2017. And look, the other part of the problem with Rand Paul is that he's just not a very good presidential candidate, even apart from the whole naivete. He rubs people the wrong way. He's got a prickly mien to him, if you will. And people want to feel comfortable with the person. They want an emotional connection to the person they're voting with, which is another thing that I mentioned in the book. I don't know anybody who can really feel like they could get an emotional connection to Rand Paul, whereas you can very easily see it with Donald Trump. You can easily see it with Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, even Chris Christie in his way. There's an opening there for an emotional connection, especially when you hear Chris Christie talk about his friend who passed away from drug addiction. Very moving story. You don't get that from Rand Paul. What you get is this sort of lecturing, haranguing, kind of crankiness that just doesn't sell very well. And the fact that he took his father's, 15% campaign and transformed it into 4% in Iowa, I mean, that tells you something, that Rand Paul really isn't built for a presidential election, but he's built for being a legislator, and I think that's where he needs to stay.
And just we'll get everyone's closing thoughts, but before we do, just a reminder: Going Red, available in hardcover, Kindle, wherever books are sold. If there are even like brick and mortar stores that still sell books,
oh yeah,
get it there. We still have brick and mortar stores. So, Ed, your closing thoughts?
Well, I think Iowa was an interesting. I think it was an interesting night. I think New Hampshire will be interesting in its own way. I think the race really begins in South Carolina with a significantly narrowed field in the Republican Party. Look for whatever dynamics come out of Iowa to really start emerging in South Carolina. That would be my key.
Okay, Sarah?
I think that, despite the fact that it's a nasty, tough primary, that Republicans have a lot of reason to be very happy. The Democrats have a caucus that just smelled bad, and Hillary Clinton, with all of her power, money, and influence, and the DNC chair, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, literally hiding all the debates and doing everything she can to throw roadblocks. Bernie Sanders won last night. The Democrats have an old white lady and an old white man arguing over what they're going to have for dinner, and the Republicans had Americans, first generation Americans, getting a big chunk of the vote. The majority of Iowa Republicans rejected Donald Trump. The top four contenders on the Republican ticket were three minorities. We're in a good spot. And, as much as I detest Donald Trump, if you're a conservative, you've got at least two very good options. Both Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio have strong conservative voting records. They've got the ability to raise the money and put the organization together. There's an ability argument for Marco Rubio, but Ted Cruz is not a disaster either. So there's a lot of reasons for Republicans to be very optimistic, and I hope that people kind of try to remember that.
Okay. And for my closing thoughts, I just want to give a simple shout out to our good friend Caleb Howe, just because I'm wearing my favorite Deadpool t-shirt today, and I know he would appreciate that. So for Ed, for Sarah, for super producer Aaron, and for my former boss, Charlene, in case she's watching this, I just interviewed Ed Morrissey. This has been another episode of the EveryJoe podcast. Find us on everyjoe.com, #EJPC. We will see you next week. Peace.